Hi there. Welcome to our event here in the library. My name is Stephanie Presseller. I am the Sustainability Manager here at Moraine Valley. Directly behind you is our Center for Sustainability, so if you ever have other faculty ask you to do presentations on sustainability-related topics and you need some information, come find me in that office. Also, our librarians are extremely resourceful. If you haven't been using them for anything, I encourage you to do so. This event today is part of our Earth Month celebration, so Earth Day is always April 22nd, but we try to do things all month long here at Moraine Valley. So our talk today is Real Talk, Climate, and Advocacy. I'm super excited to have with us Link Cohen, who is part of the Climate Reality Project Leadership Corps, and also Dr. Jim Angel, who is our state climatologist. Both of them are going to speak to you about climate change, what's happening here in Illinois, in Chicagoland, and why we need to be hopeful and why we need to be advocates. So without further ado, because I want them to tell you all about it, I'm going to introduce Link Cohen to you, and we'll get started. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. So I know it's kind of a heck of a day to talk about global warming, isn't it? But this is weather, and that's different from climate. How many people have seen the Al Gore movies, either An Inconvenient Truth or An Inconvenient Sequel? Okay, just a very few of you. They're worth seeing. An Inconvenient Sequel is the updated version and readily available, I think, on your streaming sources. I would urge you to take a look. So I have been trained by Al Gore in talking about climate change, and before I do that, I'm going to give you a little bit about myself and who I am, and then we're going to hear from the expert, Dr. Angel, and then I'm going to give you a little taste of what the slideshow is like, and hopefully maybe I'll get invited back to do a more detailed version of the slideshow. I graduated from college in 1969. There was a civil rights movement going on, and it was there were some notable successes that captured my imagination. It still had a long way to go, and it still does. While I was a college student, movement was rising. There was a student movement rising, demanding educational reform and an end to the Vietnam War. And activism was incipient. I joined VISTA, part of the federal anti-poverty program known as the Domestic Peace Corps, which sent youthful volunteers into low-income neighborhoods to live and organize, a choice that was influenced by the strong emotions that the battle for racial justice had stirred in me. That choice determined what I would do for the rest of my life as an organizer, activist, and, I hoped, agent of social change. After VISTA, I went to work in a steel mill in northwest Indiana, believing that that kind of change that I wanted to bring about could only happen if working people rose up and fought for it. I spent 18 years there, got active in the union, was elected a shop steward, became editor of the print publication that went to the 18,000 members of the steel workers who worked for our steel company. In the meantime, my wife and I raised 2 kids. We helped organize a community group in our neighborhood. I started dabbling in electoral politics, and I got elected as a delegate to the statewide Democratic Convention in Indiana. Eventually, I decided to leave the mill, mostly because it was dangerous and unhealthy. I went back to school and got a master's degree in journalism. I got a job with a union, putting out a newspaper that went to the 100,000 members in the state of Illinois. I did that for 20 years, writing about public employees, like your teachers and the non-academic staff here, and the work that they do and the political and social issues that affect them. When I retired, I knew I wasn't done. I'd lived with my life with a commitment to making a difference, to contribute to society. When I thought about it, it was obvious. Now I had grandkids. If I stood by and let climate change happen without a fight, I was leaving them a world much worse than the one my parents and grandparents left me. I had to at least try. So I went to the climate march in New York in 2014 with hundreds of thousands of other people, and I signed up to be trained by Vice President Al Gore and his Climate Reality Project in how to talk about climate change. And that's how I got here. So I hope that you find Dr. Angel's presentation enlightening, and I'll be back to talk a little bit more about climate change and what you can do.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. Does it feel like April or March or February or December? I'm not sure there. It's a little chilly out there this morning. This always happens to me. You get asked to do a climate change talk, and you get into blizzard or it gets abnormally cold. So that just kind of goes with the territory, I guess. So let's see. Let's switch sides here. Uh-oh, am I going to mess up links? Okay. Okay, there we go. Right. So I'm at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, which is down south of here. Yay! All right. And so I work on the campus there at the place called the Prairie Research Institute. So we do a lot of research on pretty much the natural resources of Illinois. So we've got people that look at surface water and groundwater, and I look at rainfall and temperatures, and we've got other folks that are doing other things there as well. So it's all right there on the campus. And today we're going to talk about climate and weather and all that good stuff. So my two favorite phrases when people ask me the difference between weather and climate, one is climate is what you expect and weather is what you get. The other one is climate is what are the clothes in your closet and the weather is what you wear that day. So it kind of gives you a sense that the climate is kind of the big picture, long-term situation of what's going on, and the weather is what's happening right now or next week or last week and so forth. So there's kind of this difference. So we get hit a lot with that on those kind of discussions about what's weather and climate, because sometimes we can have weather events that are counterintuitive to climate change. So we talk about, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, about how Illinois is warming, U.S. is warming, the global is warming. But if you look at short snapshots, we can actually see periods where we're actually fairly cold. And this is the temperature departures from normal for the globe for this winter. So December, January, February, and you see the Midwest, kind of the central U.S. there is a cold spot. But you don't have to go too far to hit some hot spots, southwestern U.S., Alaska, and then you look at South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia. Those places have all been warm. So a lot of this is actually cold air coming out of Canada, the Arctic region this winter. And by the way, it's kind of a classic La Nina pattern. And we don't have time to talk too much about that today, but that's just kind of what's going on here with this picture. So the point is that we can have local conditions that are going against the grain for short periods of time, and that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove climate change. So there's two parts to climate change of what I call the natural variability, and that's what's happening forever and will forever happen on the Earth's climate. So we know things like there's variations in solar activity, there's orbital changes around the sun, and you throw in a couple of large volcanic eruptions and a host of other things that are going on at all these time scales. And that has been going on, that will continue into the future. So that's given us some pretty interesting climate in Illinois, from ice ages to very warm periods. But on top of that, we have what I call the human influences of climate change. And those include the trapping of heat from the greenhouse gases. And that's what we'll spend most of our time talking about today. But there's also changes in the land cover as well. And some of the times these kind of interact. So for example, in the Chicago area, we're affected by the bigger picture of greenhouse gases. But on top of that, we got the urban effects of a warmer environment in the urban area. And also we're more likely to see more runoff from heavy rainfall events in urban areas because you have more parking lots, you got roads and streets and houses and roofs and so forth. So there's that kind of aggravates some of the conditions that we're seeing, makes them worse from the global climate change issues. So that's kind of what's going on. So it's kind of a big mess. There's natural things going on. There's climate change due to greenhouse gases, and then there's also these local changes all going on simultaneously. So just a brief recap on greenhouse effect. It's a natural effect, thank goodness, because we'd be about 20 degrees colder if it weren't for that. So it's a natural effect of trapping some of the warmth that reaches your surface from the sunlight. And the background of that is right now, if you took us out of the equation, it'd be about 275 parts per million, but we've jacked that up to about 400 parts per million. And greenhouse gases are very efficient at trapping that heat. So a little change can make a big difference in how much heat is trapped. And in fact, if you look at, this is a climate science special report that just came out back in November, and this is now the warmest period in the history of modern civilization. So there's been other periods that have been warmer, but we weren't around to know that. This is the one that's important for us, is the one we're in right now, and that human activities are the dominant cause of the observed changes since the mid 20th century. So about 1950s, 60s onward, and we'll show that here in a minute, but here's the actual CO2 concentrations. This is what I was talking about. You get down about in 1960 or so, it was about 310 parts per million, and now we're up over 400 parts per million. So just in not that long of a time period, we've seen a big increase over time, and that's projected to continue on up until the ceiling there, and so that's a big problem. That's the part that we're contributing it to. So if you look at global temperatures since the 1870s or so, the late 1800s, early 1900s, a relatively cool period in world history. Then we have this period where we kind of warmed up a little bit, and then we kind of plateaued here for several years. And then since about the late 70s, we've really taken off on the warming. And this is the part of the record that they're talking about, the increase in the warming being caused by humans. This is a pretty strong and steady signal. So you can see here, there's a lot of cases where it goes up and down and back and forth, and sometimes it's warm, sometimes it's cold. But from about the 1970s onwards, there's been a steady upward march in the temperatures. So that's the thing that we're looking at right now. I can tell you all kinds of stories about this data. It's actually a challenge to put this together, but we won't. But in the last 1,700 years, to put that in perspective, there's back in the 1700s and early 1800s, there's something called the Little Ice Ages, probably linked to solar activity where the Earth's temperatures were much cooler. And then here's some earlier periods. Here's a medieval warming period. But you see kind of, if you look reconstructed temperatures over the last 1,700 years, we've kind of been bouncing along. We've actually been cooling a little bit and then warming. All of this is probably in through here what I call natural variability. So there's a lot of changes going on, but they're not due to us. But here's the part where we come into play, and here's how much warmer we are than in the last 1,700 years. So big dramatic change in the temperatures. This one I kind of debate about whether to put this on there or not. There's a lot going on here. There's about 2 or 3 data sets of observed data that are plotted out here. And then on top of that, in this reddish line, I guess that's kind of red, almost looks orange, are the averages of a bunch of climate models that were run across this record to see how they match up with the historical record. So climate models help us do experiments. They're kind of like our lab for seeing what happens if we increase greenhouse gases, or we do this with urbanization, or do other kinds of testing. It's a way to experiment because you use the laws of physics and other relationships to define the climate system, and that gives you at least a pretty good idea of what's going on. So this is what happens when you throw everything in the pot, you know, volcanoes, solar activity, and our activity. If you take out everything but the greenhouse gas activity, this is what the average of the models looks like. So it goes from matching the temperatures to actually not matching the temperature. So what this means is that all of the temperature increase we've seen observed in the last 30 or 40 years was actually caused by the greenhouse gases. All of this shows here is that once you take those out, we would probably have seen not much warming at all in the last 30 or 40 years. So that's one way of many ways to test to see if we're causing any changes to climate. And so here's kind of just a brief picture of the future, and we won't talk too much about this today, but there's just some visions of the future, and there's what we're kind of committed to. So these are in degrees Celsius here, but you double it, that'd give you what it would be in Fahrenheit pretty much. And kind of one more optimistic case is what they call RCP 4.5, which is science talk to the kind of forcing that's involved there. But this is where you have the increase in the greenhouse gases, then you actually decrease the levels for the rate for a while, and it kind of bottoms out here. And you see with this one, you still are committed to about a 2.5 degree warming by the next 100 to 200 years. This is the business as usual case where we just continue doing what we're doing now, and that's where we're going to end up with. So global temperatures by the end of the 21st century will be about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, which would be about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you go up from there. So the point here is that you can make a difference by changing the amount of gases you put in the atmosphere. It's not a hopeless cause. We're still committed to some amount of warming, but not as much as if we continue doing what we have been doing. So this is the temperature trends across the United States. In most areas, if you look at the annual numbers, it's about 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, a little stronger out west and a little stronger up north. Illinois is kind of in a not too bad a situation. We're in a part of the U.S. that's not increasing the temperatures as much as some other areas. In fact, there's some areas down south like Alabama and Mississippi there that are actually getting a little cooler. We think there's one theory on that is that we're getting more precipitation, so it's getting cloudier down in that area and up and through Illinois, so that's causing our temperatures not to warm up as rapidly as they are out west, where it's much drier. But if you talk to people out in the west or up north, you're going to get a different conversation about climate change than you would in Illinois. They're going to tell you that things are a lot more pronounced than what we see here in Illinois. If you look at Illinois, we've warmed up by about 1.5 degrees or so over the last century. So this is the statewide temperatures from 1895 to present. And the line that bounces up and down, that's the change from one year to the next. And then this green line, I've kind of smoothed out some of those bounces so you kind of see the long-term pattern. So if you remember, the global temperatures warmed up through about the 1940s, and then we kind of cooled off a little bit. And then here in Illinois, I'd say since about the 1990s, we've warmed up a little bit, but it's very inconsistent. One year we're a little warm and next year we're cold. So it does bounce back and forth. And that's kind of one of the characteristics of the climate of Illinois is that we have a very variable climate. So it's sometimes hard to tease out some of these trends. But if you look at the future, first I showed you those, I call the low emission scenario, which is that 4.5, and then the high emission is the much worse case scenario. By the mid-century, the Midwest is going to be about 4 degrees warmer, and with high emission, about 5 degrees warmer. At the end of the century, with the low emission, it's about 5.6 degrees, and with the high emission, it's 9.5. So some pretty big changes across the Midwest as we move on into the future. And so, 4 degrees or even 5 degrees, you say, well, what's the big deal on that? I mean, certainly if you turned up the thermostat in here by 5 degrees, you'd notice it, but none of us would probably pass out from that. It would just be a little warmer. But the thing is, what it does is it also moves all the extremes to that direction too. So now 100-degree weather is pretty rare in Chicago. About once every 2 or 3 years, we might see 100-degree weather. By mid-century, in the worst case scenario, it could be about 8 degrees or 8 times that we'd see the 100-degree days. By late century, on average, it'd be about 22 days. In the worst case, the hottest of the models was showing it actually being 60 days of 100-degree weather. That's like living in Phoenix, Arizona instead of Chicago. So kind of give you an idea. So when we talk about 5 degrees or 9 degrees warmer, it's the impacts that we're going to see is on the extremes. That's where we're going to feel it in both our health and in the bank account is on the extreme side. So there's some other impacts from all of this. So if we have warmer temperatures, you might see, this is actually my granddaughter that found a woolly worm in the backyard 2 years ago in January. So here she is, light jacket, and I zipped up there. So, you remember 2 years ago, we had a very mild winter. It was just very mild temperatures, not much snow. That was about 4 to 4.5 degrees above normal from where we are today on terms of temperature. So that would be kind of give you a taste of what the mid-century might look like in terms of winter weather. So one thing that could happen is we have a lot more insects survive the winter and a lot more invasive species move into Illinois because the weather conditions are more favorable for the kind of growing conditions. The thing we've been wrestling with the last couple of years, and you may or may not have noticed this, is when we have mild winters, it actually sets us up for increased vulnerability of frost in the spring. So what happens is the apple trees, the peach trees, and all the ornamental trees and bushes and so forth, it gets to be February and we're in 70-degree weather, or March and it's 80-degree weather. They think it's spring, and so they go ahead and take off, and then they get that frost in April when they usually occur, and they get hammered by that. And we've had several cases of billion-dollar disasters in the fruit industry because of those kinds of situations. And we kind of had that this year. We've been fairly cold, but we had some warm snaps in there, and so there has been some damage this year from that. So on the temperature side, warmer winters and springs, more warm days, fewer cold days. So if you don't like winter, it probably may be good news, but it means that summers are going to be a lot more interesting and an increased chance of actual heat waves going on there. So that's the temperature side. If we look at the precipitation side, this is a little different. So we got the middle part of the country there is in green. That means we're getting wetter in the central part of the U.S., getting drier in the southwest, and it's kind of mixed bag on the east coast there. But central U.S., including Illinois, has been getting wetter over the last century, by about 10 to 20% wetter. So one thought is that this just is, we're just getting, as you warm up the atmosphere, it get more evaporation, you rev up that hydrologic cycle, so you're getting more water into the atmosphere that's available for precipitation. This is the annual precipitation for Illinois, and it looks a lot like the temperature one in that it bounces around a lot from year to year. But you see on that red line that I put in there of the moving average, it shows that it's increasing by about 10 to 15%. Kind of depends on where you are in the state, but about 10 to 15% increase in the overall precipitation. Now, the other thing we've seen too is that this earlier period here, we had a lot of really big droughts in the early part of the 20th century. We still get them. There's some dry years. Here's 2005 and 2012 were very dry years, but we're getting a lot of really wet years. And so we're getting these situations where it's just wet all year, or we get months of heavy precipitation. And so we're seeing more flooding and less of the really big droughts. Now, that doesn't mean the droughts are going to go away, but it just means that that's kind of where the problems have shifted for us, has been more on the flooding side and less on the drought side. So this is the number of extreme precipitation events defined as 2 inches or more. And 2 inches is kind of a magic number. It's about where you start to see flooding in streets and basements and things like that. It doesn't always hold true, but it's kind of a benchmark for that. If you look at the first half of the 20th century, the numbers are much less, and then about the 1950s or 60s, they started to switch over, and really since about the 1970s or so, they've really ramped up. So we've seen this pretty big shift in the number of 2-inch rainfall events on average at a given location. And I would say on top of this is a statewide number, is that some of the strongest trends we're seeing are actually more pronounced than this in this part of the state. For whatever reason, this part of the state has been getting much wetter in terms of overall precipitation and also with these heavier rainfall events. So that can be problematic, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But here's some radar shots of some rain events in the last year or so. So this is back in August. So you can see we're about right in here. So we got some purples there. In this case, they were on the order of about 10 to 15 inches of rain over about a couple of week period there. Another batch in October, and I think there was, so we got August and October was very wet in this part of the state. And then we had this. Now you guys probably didn't feel the brunt of this as much as some other folks, but this is what happened at the end of February, where we had large areas of rain that were on the order of 4 to 5 or 6 inches, and then you get down in here and they're up to about 10 to 15 inches. February is typically our driest month of the year. We get about 2 inches of precipitation. So if you get 6 inches of precipitation, that means you've got about 3 times as much, and most of this fell as rain. So that's the other thing. So if you have a mild winter, you're more likely to have rain events than snowfall events. And to have this much moisture and this much action going on in February is actually pretty surprising. So what this is doing then is it's not only causing flooding, but it's also falling on all those bare fields across Illinois and the rest of the Midwest. And so you're increasing soil erosion and you're getting more runoff of nutrients. So those are some other problems that we're seeing in Illinois with all this precipitation. So it's not just the flooding. If you look at the future, you can look at several different maps. So this is mid-century seasonal precipitation. So anywhere where it's kind of in this blue-green colors here, we're showing an increase. So most of the U.S. is showing an increase, getting drier in the southern part of the U.S., especially the Southwest. So winter, spring, summer is actually getting drier, expected to get drier, and then fall is kind of a mixed bag, maybe a little bit wetter. But so overall, wetter winters, wetter springs, and was kind of what we're seeing in the last several years. And then a drier summer, which can be problematic for agriculture because summer is when we really need the precipitation to grow crops. So we could have this paradox, it sounds funny to say, of more floods and more droughts under future climate change. And this is why. We might have more spring flooding and more summertime droughts. So overall, the precipitation has increased over most of the U.S. And we, in that report I showed you early on in the talk there, they give that medium confidence of that continuing on into the future. But they have high confidence that we'll see more of the heavy rain events as we move forward. It's hard to continue getting 10% wetter every century. At some point, you're just going to run out of rainfall there. But in the wintertime, we're going to see more rain and less snow, and we'll probably see a shorter snowfall season as we move forward. So this is a report that we did a couple of years ago on urban flooding. And it kind of highlights some of the issues that we face here in Illinois in that we're having this wetter climate, so 10 to 15% wetter, plus we're having more of these heavy rain events, which is causing a lot more urban flooding. So that's street flooding, basement flooding, those kinds of things. And on top of that, it's occurring in an urban area, so you got all this flashy runoff, so it runs off much faster. And on top of that, we got aging infrastructure in the city of Chicago. So the ability to handle that storm water is decreasing over time. So we got this kind of perfect storm there of these things coming together that compound the problem. So even if the climate wasn't changing, we still have these troubles. The problem is that the climate is making it worse. And they did a 10-year study, and there was about $2 billion in damages in Illinois alone over this 10-year period. So it's a significant problem for us. So the key messages as we kind of start to wrap things up here is that Illinois is getting warmer, it's getting wetter. In fact, we're probably we're in this unique combination now of being warmer and wetter. The 1930s we were hot and dry, now we're hot and wet, so it's a little different combination than what we've seen before. And also we're seeing more of the flooding and heat waves associated with losses in health and wealth. And just kind of give you a ballpark idea of what, there's a economic study that was just released last year that looked at the impacts across the Midwest. By the time you get to the mid part of the century, the heat wave losses in dollar amounts will be on the order of $1 billion per year. And this is from losses due to people being disabled because of the heat, also because it impacts outside workers, so you slow down construction, you slow down harvest and planting of crops and all that good stuff. And so the impacts of these are going to start piling up as we move forward, and it can be pretty significant. The other thing about especially with heat waves that's very troubling is that they can occur in urban areas, but they also can occur in rural areas as well. There's a study done just a few years ago on that, where they looked at in rural areas it's problematic because they don't have access to health care as well. And so it's going to be pretty significant impacts in Illinois, and it tends to impact the lower income groups and also the areas that are more urbanized, just because if you're in an urban area, you get the urban heat island, which aggravates the situation even more. So it's going to be kind of preferentially impacting parts of our population. Those that are most vulnerable are going to get hit the hardest. But there's also other challenges if you look at our overall economy of the state in terms of agriculture and ecosystems and so forth. So the impacts on increased disease, pests, and the flooding and so forth are going to increase as well. And we don't have too much time to talk about that today, but we're working on a national assessment right now. It'll come out in about November. They'll talk a lot about these kinds of impacts that we may see with future climate change. So they talk about it in more detail, a little more systematic way. So as we kind of start to wind things down on my part here, we've got climate change. There's two parts to the equation as far as the response. One is adaptation. So that's kind of what I hinted at earlier there with the city of Chicago and the infrastructure and so forth. So one thing is you can start to try to be more resilient, and we're seeing that going on in communities around Illinois, and especially the Chicago area. We're trying to be more resilient to these heavy rain events, more resilient to heat waves and so forth, and try to build that into the planning and construction moving forward. So that's adaptation. And then on the other side is the mitigation, which deals directly with reducing the greenhouse gases. And some of these have mutual benefits. So sometimes, if you if you reduce water use, not only is that a better way to deal with future droughts, but also water use. You don't think about this, but the water comes out of your sink. That's not magic. There's a whole infrastructure pumping that water around and moving it into your home and back out of your home. So there's a lot of energy involved with that as well. So there's kind of these double impacts on those kinds of things. So there's a lot of mutual benefits from this. So that's one thing that we're working a lot on now is a lot of these adaptation projects across the Chicago area. And maybe come back again for another day to talk about some of those. But another thing is that I've been watching, very interesting, is the idea of climate change and people's views on that. They've actually changed over time. I get asked a lot, do you believe in climate change? And I said, well, I'm more of a data person, so I have to look at data to be convinced of something. And I've looked at the data for the last 30 years, and you look at Illinois, you look at the U.S., you look at the global data, and it's pretty strong signal. And I think pretty much all the scientists agree that that's a real thing, that climate change is real, and that's a real problem. The general population, so it's I'd say about 95% of the scientists. But if you look at the distribution, if you look at people that are that are alarmed or concerned or cautious, if you look at those three categories, that's 3/4 of the general population too. So we kind of put this as kind of this binary discussion of do you believe yes or no in climate change, but in fact there's actually kind of this broad spectrum of concern, and I think that's kind of what's driving a lot of this. And I can tell you a lot of stories about. Personal stories about people that maybe started out as being skeptical of climate change, but now they're not, and so forth. And a lot of it boils down to when it starts to impact you personally, then it becomes a very personal issue for you. So that's the climate change side of it. And so I think they're recording this today, and so here's my email. I got a blog, I also have a website, I also do Twitter. So a lot of stuff I talk about today and in the future will be on, especially on the blog. The website gets updated a little more slowly, but there's my contact information, and I will be here between sessions and then after the last session for the reception. So if you want to talk one-on-one about things, I'd be happy to do that. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Link. Thanks.
Okay. All right, so quickly, we've had pretty much of slides to digest, but I'm going to just go through a few. The climate's changing. We know why. And the pattern is very clear. This is a little bit, 2014, 2015, and 2016, each year became the hottest year. 2017 failed to become the hottest year, but it was close. So burning fossil fuels, that's what's doing it. This is the amount of carbon that we've been putting into the air. And you can see that it's going up at the rate that the temperature is rising with Dr. Angel's. These are worldwide extreme weather catastrophes. We know what will happen with global warming because it's happening. People all over the, and it's happening right here. This is the Northern Illinois data that Dr. Angel was referring to. So you can see that very recently the amount of flooding and extreme water events in this area are going up markedly. When it rains, it pours. There's something you can do about it. Come on.
The youth of the world have the most to lose from the climate crisis and the most to gain from acting to stop it. That's why the Climate Reality Project launched the Campus Core and the 100% Committed campaign to help students build the clean energy future they want and need. College has always been a place of idealism combined with activism, the place where hope and hard work come together to create progress. So it makes sense that today, this generation is powering the shift to renewable energy. Climate Reality's Campus Core brings students together to organize their campus community to become 100% committed to renewable energy and ending the climate crisis.
Not only do they find ways to integrate sustainability into every aspect of campus life,
we demand that our campuses are going to be powered with 100% renewable electricity by the year 2030.
When students find their voice, they become a power that can't be stopped.
there's energy right here at our fingertips. Let's use it, let's utilize it. This is clean energy.
Time's now. Actually overdue, actually. I think you're a little bit behind, actually.
Absolutely a push, yeah.
That's our duty as people in privileged countries.
For a healthy future, we need clean energy.
From the campus to the community, to elections and beyond, the Climate Reality Project's Campus Corps is about helping a new generation find its voice, build local momentum, and create tangible victories, proving that 100% renewable energy is possible for communities around the globe, all accelerating the shift to a clean energy future.
Let's see, we're not advancing here. Okay, so the message is you have a voice. Look at what high school kids from Florida have done by raising their voice. Recently, Dick's Sporting Goods announced that not only will it no longer sell assault weapons in high-capacity magazines, it's going to destroy all the ones that it has in its stock. That's a direct effect of what those students have done. If you want to make climate change your cause, there's plenty to do. Do you have those? Pardon?
Yeah, the handouts?
Yes.
Yes. I'll tell them.
Okay. We have some handouts with what you can do. I encourage you to take a look at them and get active and get involved, because it's going to get hot. Your world does depend on it.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Angel. Thank you, Link Cohen. We have some time for some question and answers, but what Link was referencing is that there are some handouts kind of scattered around with resources for you to learn more or get involved, be an advocate, etc. So if you can't find those, find me. Also, the sign-in sheets are around if you needed to sign in, so please do that. So are there any questions for either Link or Dr. Angel?
Hi, thanks for coming out. With companies like Foxconn and BP sucking thousands upon gallons of water out of our natural resource and our fresh water systems, is there any type of impact studies that are going on? Are we going to be able to recognize some exponential effects at some point?
Yeah, are you talking about use of water and putting it in the atmosphere, or just in general, just using the water?
Just general use of the water.
Okay. Yeah, there's actually part of Illinois' Department of Natural Resources actually oversees a lot of that kind of activity in Illinois. I'm assuming there's a counterpart in Wisconsin that would also look at that. But also there's pretty much around the Great Lakes, there's a pretty strong organization of all the Great Lakes states with concerns about how the water of the Great Lakes are used, because that's such an outstanding resource with fresh water that they don't want to pump out and then pump down the Illinois River or anything like that. So they're very careful about the usage within the basin. So we'll see how that, but I'm sure that, I think the answer is yes. They're looking at that very closely. You may not see it in the newspapers soon, but yeah, they do a lot of studies and discussions about that.
Thank you.
To say something, like why our government doesn't make anything. Like government in Canada, they are doing so much in recycling, and they are more involving to do more things for climate change, not like US.
That's a good question. I would say in the U.S., kind of watching it for many years now, is that we kind of seem to go through these cycles of we're very responsive and then we're not so responsive. And I would say now is probably one of the low points in responsiveness, and then Actually, in the Obama administration, there was quite a bit of interest on climate change, and there was a lot of excitement about that. I think now the attention has kind of shifted to the cities to do stuff, and actually, in one way, the cities are maybe actually a better position to really do something about this. So the city of Chicago, many of the surrounding cities are having a lot of programs that are making real impacts. Sometimes with the federal government, it's so big and so ponderous that anything that goes on there just takes so long that it's hard to get any real results out of it. Whereas with the state and local officials, you get more of a response time out of that. And so I would say right now that that's where the action is at the city level.
I'd like to address that too, and I would say that part of the responsibility is you, that your government will respond to you if you raise your voice. And if enough of us raise our voice, the government will be forced to respond. So it's a matter of we have to do something because the government hasn't been doing enough.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Oh.
Here.
Sorry. Thank you.
Well, I noticed where Donald Trump said he's not spending no money towards it. No offense to you guys, but it was like ain't nothing we can do about it.
Well, actually, that's an interesting situation because there's a lot of the rhetoric was that we're not going to spend money on climate change. But then if you look at the actual budgets that come out of Congress, and Congress is the one that holds the checkbook. It's there's the president's budget, and then that's kind of the guidance for the Congress. But Congress can do what they want, and so actually the spending programs, or knock on wood, have not been as impacted by the rhetoric as much as we feared. So some of the, except for maybe EPA is probably taking a big hit, but like NOAA and NASA and some of the other scientific organizations have fared much better than originally thought with this. That doesn't seem anything that's a necessarily good thing because there's still other ways that they can affect the policy. So, but at least budgetary-wise, we've probably been a little better shape than I thought we would be. Yeah, sure.
Don't get offended by this question.
Okay.
What is your thing of praying about it, seeking, asking God? Do you believe in that?
Yeah, so that's another aspect of all this that we've never really explored, and probably it's an area that we probably should explore more is the effect of, what about religion? What about Christianity and other groups about and faith? I guess that's the word I want to say, about faith and climate change, because there is the calling to help the poor and others in time of need, and we're talking about heat waves and flooding and so forth. So that very much I think ties into a lot of teachings on from a lot of faiths that, and there are some groups that are doing it. There's somebody I know, Catherine Hayhoe, that's done a lot of work in this area, and she's very good at talking to those groups. And yes, I think that's a real untapped need.
And one other question, I've been hearing like that movie that they had where the hose was popping out of everything. Be honest with us, are we under that? Is that getting ready to happen? Because I noticed when they just built an expressway on my way out, what's that, 94. And they just put that out there, and I noticed it's a slope.
Let's see, is that geostorms?
That has something to do with this weather, and I know it.
That part I'm not so sure about that.
We're not getting all the information.
But I think, there are the local issues of sinkholes, and that's certainly, in fact, my wife's interested in that part of it, but that's, in this area, we don't have to worry about it quite as much as some other parts of the U.S. And there actually isn't, could go on, but there's actually tied to the climate change in that if you get areas that you pump out the groundwater and then the surface can collapse, and so there's some impacts in that regard.
Yeah, I'd like to say one thing about your question about what the government is doing, and what Dr. Angel said about cities doing stuff. There are more than 50 cities in the United States already that have committed to going 100% renewable energy for their city in a certain amount of time. And the goal for what time it is has varied. But again, the place where you live, if they haven't made that commitment, you can push your elected officials to go there.
Thank you. I will just say that that is true, and like cities are doing a lot of different things, and so are our governors in many different states. Globally, most of the world's leaders have signed on to commitments for climate change. Also, most of our religious leaders have signed on to things that argue for action on climate change. If you're interested in learning more about those things, Link does have some resources for you. There's also plenty of resources on the web, on the internet. I'm happy to answer any of those questions for you. And also higher ed is also leading the change for climate change. But a lot of colleges and universities around the world, including Moraine Valley, have signed the President's Climate Commitment, which commits this college campus to going carbon neutral by our 75th anniversary. That's only 25 years from now. But Dr. Jenkins, our president, decided that was important. That's something that we should be focusing on. So when we look to just our national government, we need to look beyond that. We need to look locally. We need to look at other institutions and what are they doing. You all have a voice. You live here, and it's your voice to use, and you should use it. So thank you so much for your time. Again.